Hello, and welcome to Pulumi TV. This is Modern Infrastructure. My name is David Flanagan, although you may know me from across the internet as Raw Code. Now, we don't often do Modern Infrastructure live, but I decided to shake things up a little bit this week. Today, we're going to be taking a look at using Pulumi's new YAML support via the Qlang or Q language. We did an episode on Qlang around 2 weeks ago where we were joined by Paul Jolly, one of the core maintainers of Q. And I've been experimenting with it a fair bit since then. I really think that Q is a powerful data language. And if we want to generate YAML to be consumed by Pulumi, it allows us to do some pretty cool things. So we're going to take a look at provisioning Cloudflare DNS records. Now, the reason I'm going for DNS records is that they are very declarative. We don't need a lot of imperative code, which means structuring it as data works really well. And what Q allows us to do is to build some abstractions around the way that we produce that declarative structure. And I think it's really cool. Now, there is a fair amount of Q involved, but you write it once and you can reconsume it over and over again. So the code that we're going to be looking at today is available, at least as a pull request at this point in time, on the Pulumi/examples repository. All right, let's pull my screen up. There we go. So the first thing I want to do is show you what this would look like in YAML. Now, YAML is actually a really good format to declare DNS records. But I still want to convince you that using Q and a little bit of magic there will improve your Pulumi YAML experience. Now, with Pulumi YAML programs, our mission is to put all of our resources under a resources key, like so. Every resource must have a name. So for the domains themselves, I am literally calling them the domain with a dot substituted as a dash. From there, we tell it the type of resource that we wish to create. So this is a Cloudflare zone, and that zone has some properties. And really for the zone, it's nice and simple. We're just saying that the domain or the zone that we're going to manage is rawcode.dev. And that is our first resource. After that, we want to start adding records to our zone. So here we have rawcode.dev no email. This may be a domain that I do not wish to configure email on. And when you don't want to send email from a domain, the best thing you can do is set up a text record to inform all the major email providers that, hey, this domain should not send any emails, which means it'll end up in spam if some bad actors try to send it. Okay, then we have this name here followed by a type of that's actually a little bug, but we're not fussed about that. It's okay. Then we have the name of the record itself, and then we have type Cloudflare record, and then this has properties. Now we're using the YAML syntax to reference other resources and get outputs from them. So here you can see that we're referencing our zone, which is rawcode-dev, and we want to know the zone ID. We configure the name, the TTL, the type, and the value, and that is it. Now, this is very similar for the next example, only instead of no email, I've decided to actually set a few MX records. So we configure the zone as we did, and then down here, we're actually saying we're going to configure this for G Suite. And for G Suite, we're just going to set up some MX records, and there's a few of them. The last thing I did in this domain was add an A record that would just point to 1.1.1.1, entirely useless, but I just wanted to make sure that we could set that record if we wanted to. So YAML works really, really well for defining DNS records. Something that you probably do manually, but having them in this declarative format that you can commit to Git is actually really cool. Now, we're not going to use YAML today. The code is there. You've seen it. You can now do it if you wish, but I want to show you something else. So let's pop over to my main.q. Now, it's not terribly smaller, but the more domains that I add, it will condense down to much smaller than the YAML alternative. But we do get some toil or chore removed from the typing experience, and we'll cover that as we go over the queue. So the first thing is I am importing a helper utility that I have written, and it's just in this directory. So I've made up my own kind of package name, which is examples.pulumi.com/DNS. From there, we're loading something called Cloudflare, and we're looking for the controller module package. Same thing. We have our top level resources key, just like we did in the YAML, only after that, things get a little bit different. So here, we're using this convenience structure of the controller, and we're saying that we want a new domain. This domain has a domain name, which I've just called domain, and it has an option for configuring the email. So I don't have to tell it what that SPF text record is, and I don't have to tell it what all the MX records are for G Suite. Instead, we've built in some little helpers. So here I just say that my email configuration is actually a controller.noEmail. And that hash symbol or pound symbol, depending on where you're from, just tells us that we are using a Q definition, something defined in Q. Excuse me. Then we have our second domain. So we're saying, okay, we have one more domain. This one is domainrocco.com. Only this time, our email is going to be configured as G Suite and not noEmail. And then the one record that I added, www name to 1.1.1.1. Now, in order to get Q to squeeze in to the format that the Pulumi YAML provider expects, we're using something kind of like a function call in Q, but really we're just requesting a subset of some properties within the Q document. So I'm calling it create, so it kind of feels like a function, but it isn't really a function. Okay, so how does this work? Well, let's open our controller.q. So the first thing we do is we're going to import the strings package. This is one of those really cool things about Q. Now, YAML, we don't have the ability to do string processing, regular expressions, search and replace, anything like that. But when we use Q, we can actually import a lot of the Q standard library. And you'll see here that when we define a zone, and we don't really know what that is yet, but that's okay, is that we pass in a domain, which is a string value. The resource name is what we want to call the resource within the Pulumi program. Now, it can't have the dots in it. This is actually going to cause you an error. So we use the Q standard language or standard library to do a strings replace on the domain, replacing all the dots with a dash, and the -1 just says to replace them all. Another really cool thing about Q is that we get interpolation. So for the zone ID, this actually references an output property on a resource. So what we actually need is the resource name with a dot and then zone ID, surrounded by a $sign and some curly brackets. The interpolation part of Q is this here. We do \, round brackets, and then we tell it what we want to drop in there. And that is just the resource name at the same scope. We then have the properties that are being passed in. This is really just to keep them isolated from what we consider the inputs. And that's like a Q, because I'm using this weird Q pseudo function syntax, we want to kind of differentiate that. And then we have our create function, which is just a small subset of data that spits out the YAML that the Pulumi program expects. So we use more interpolation to get the resource name, and then we describe the Pulumi YAML resource. So we're just pulling in properties and spitting out the properties. Hopefully, nice and simple. In order to make DNS records work, I'm actually using a hidden field in Q. So that is any field that starts with an underscore. It just means that when I run Q export or anything like that, these won't ever be output as data in the document. And also they're scoped explicitly to this package. So it cannot be used by anything else, which is kind of the behavior that we want to enforce here. We want people to use our public API and not our private API. And this is very much the private API. So we have a zone, which we're saying is a type of zone. We have a type, which is a Cloudflare record. We kind of isolate the properties that we need for the Pulumi YAML resource itself, which is actually pulling from our zone. So, when we call the create function and the top level document, we're passing in that zone. And I'll show you that in a little minute. We had said the name must be a string, and we default to an @ symbol. I could have made that whatever I want, depending on what you're doing. It may make sense to go with something else, but for me, that was okay for now. We have a TTL with a default 300, which is pretty standard. We're restricting the set of DNS records that we accept. So we're only accepting A, CNAMEs, MX, and text. However, you could make that whatever kind of support you want to provide. And what you'll see is I actually then further constrain these types on the more definite versions of a DNS record. And then we tell it how to spit out the YAML that we need. Now, here's the more constrained ones. So we have a DNS record now, a public definition that can be consumed. That is an abstract DNS record, and we further constrain it. So one of the decisions I made is that MX records and DNS records would be handled separately, which means if you try to use the DNS record definition, you cannot set it to MX. You have to use the MX record definition, which is actually locked down to only MX, which makes sense. And the reason I did this is so that we can have the priority, which is only accepted on the MX records with the Cloudflare API. Hopefully that all makes sense. Now, to handle email or email configuration for the domain, I set up two more definitions. I set up no email and I set up G Suite. On no email, all we're doing is creating some sort of resource called no email, which is a DNS record with a zone and these properties. So these are the properties that set the text record that we want. And for G Suite, we do the exact same, only this time we spit out 1, 2, 3 MX records with the values that Gmail expects us to have. Now we provide a kind of a public interface to our zone, which I've called domain, which allows us to kind of encapsulate this all into one Q or YAML-based kind of description, where we say this is the domain, we accept no email or G Suite configuration, and we'll take any number of records that you want to pass through as a DNS record. So you cannot pass any other MX records. It can only be configured via the email configuration block. From there, we call create on our zone, create on our email, and then we use a comprehension in Q, which is very cool. We have the ability to loop over the records in this list, and we create the records like so. So now that you've seen all of that, we'll go back to our main.q, and you'll see we have a controller for a domain configured with no email and a domain. We have the controller for a domain configured with the domain, G Suite, and some records. So if we jump over to our Pulumi preview, there's that bug that I broke. Let's fix it very quickly. I was making changes. That'll teach me. I was trying to clean up a different bug and I introduced a new bug, but we can fix this. And I'll fix it properly. What have I got wrong? You know what? I'm going to stash all this. There we go. Don't make changes 1 minute before the stream. But as you can see, when we run a Pulumi preview, we have our two zones being created. We have our A record for rockcode.com. We have our no email for rockcode dev, and then we have our G Suite records for rockcode.com. There we go. Even though I've stashed all that, you'll see very little has changed. This file is pretty much the same. I was just trying to tidy up a few little things, and clearly I made a bit of a mistake. However, if you want to check out this demo, it is available at github.com/Pulumi/examples. The pull request is opened. I'm hoping this will be merged soon. I'm going to be doing a whole lot more with Pulumi Q, so if this interests you, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave me a comment. Let me know what else you'd like to see with Pulumi Q. Until next time, have a wonderful day. Adios.